Hello and welcome back to Untangle Your Brand. This is session 4, which is all about engaging verbally. The last session we talked about the brand core and how important it was to have this central idea, because that's going to help us with all our communication, all our engagement as we move forward. We looked at the offer, we looked at the values, we looked at the mission, but getting it summarized into 3 or 4 words like making families happier is a really good way of actually liberating the creative things around your brand. This is split up into 2 parts, actually, engage verbally. The first is all about naming, and the second part is all about the messaging. I would encourage you to do both parts, but if you did want to skip forward, come back to that later. But the messaging is going to be important for everyone. You may not think naming is as important for you at the moment, but there's some really useful information in that section. So we've gone through all this sort of first part of our jigsaw. We've done the insight, we've done the story. Now it's all about the verbal. Like I say, the name, the tone of voice and the messaging that you can create with that. And in the next session, without giving anything away, we're going to talk about the visual identity, because we need all the words before we can start designing. Having words is really, really important in the creative process. So how do you name a brand? Well, I think if you think about different naming approaches, a lot of people ask me about whether I should use a personal name or a corporate name. And I'm going to go through a little exercise that will help you decide. It's different for everyone is the answer. We'll then talk about different categories, how to create a name and how to choose a name. So thinking about personal names. So hello, I'm Nigel. That's my personal name. I've said it at the start of the video. I say it every time. I also have a corporate name, Pin Creative, and I don't use that as much, but it's really important because it's some sort of foundations, if you like, for what my business is, even though it's just a business of one person. Now, when you're thinking about, the difference between a personal and corporate name, the number one thing is that, sometimes personal names are very hard to find. You just put them in a search engine. Put in Nigel Davis, you'll get chess champions and rugby players. You won't get brand consultants. Obviously, if you know what I do, you put my name and my discipline, branding, you will probably find me pretty quickly. I should be on page 1. But if you put in my corporate name, providing it's original enough, which Pen Creative is, then you'll find me every time. So there's this sort of balance between, people having their individual kind of person out there or their corporate life out there. And I created this quiz to help you decide what is the most appropriate for you. So if you've got time, follow the link, do the QR code and take the quiz. It's sort of 10 questions. I think it might be 9 questions actually. They're very simple and quick that just give you an indication of what kind of name you should choose. So once you've taken the quiz and looked at your scores, you'll get an indication of whether you're kind of happy with more. Really, it's happy about exposure of your own personal brand versus having a corporate name to sort of hide behind. What I would say that even if you've got a personal brand, having a corporate brand will really help. Actually helps in some sort of legal details and things like that. Whereas the corporate brand, it's really important to have visibility as you as the business owner. So you need a bit of both really is the final answer, but this should give you some indication of what direction you should go. So if you're scoring quite highly, it's because you don't want your personal name out there as much, or you might have a bigger team of people, or you might be planning to sell. If you're scoring quite low, it'll be because you're really happy to have scrutiny. You're probably already really established as an individual, and so you're very happy just to use your name. The one thing I would say, and it's pretty obvious it's your name, is make sure the name is appropriate. Maybe sometimes names can be hard for people to spell, hard to remember, and that's just a consideration you should think about. So there's a little version of the quiz there for you to think about. Actually, you can just do that quite simply rather than following the link, but really do think about that difference between a personal name or a corporate name. The next thing to think about is thinking about creating a name. And just to sort of give you a bit of a steer, there's lots of different categories of names. And this is just to help kind of make you think a little bit about the type of name that's going to be appropriate for your business. Lots of real names, made up, people and places, descriptive. And these are all in the worksheet, so you don't need to kind of worry too much about it. But, obviously literal names like Apple and Twitter, there's so many names that are now sort of being used. These are quite hard to own. I think obscure ones like Nike, are interesting because they have a better story behind them. People are forever arguing about why Apple is called Apple, but they don't care anymore. They're $1 trillion business. Lots of made up names have been used recently as people have tried to get ownership. Some work better than others. Facebook and PayPal are kind of really easy names to think about, which are sort of the mashed up kind of compounded and blending, sticking other words together. But we've had to create new language to create new names, and that's absolutely valid. people and places, naming it, Disney, it's named after Walt Disney who created it. And that's very common into consumer brands. But even using fictitious things, Starbucks named after a character from Moby Dick. So there's lots of different ways that you can go with names, more descriptive acronyms. IKEA is a combination of the founders' names and actually where they came from. So there's just lots of different things. And what's really interesting, I think, about brands is that they have stories behind them, brand names, and it's really important to identify those. So what makes a great name? Distinctive, easy to say, spell, read, all those things. It's got to be memorable, but it shouldn't be too generic. It's really hard to own a generic word. Always check availability, but I always say don't get too hung up in it, and considering purchasing domains. The number one thing about choosing a name, though, is be brave. The unusual becomes accepted as the usual quickly becomes forgotten. It's a tried and tested thing, is that actually with something that has a bit more kind of originality to it, it gets remembered rather than just the everyday stuff. So be brave is a number one thing. So where to start when you're creating a name? Well, we've got all the information. We've done our mind map. Hopefully you've been continuing to build that. And that is going to be full of ideas, chock-a-block with ideas that you can use to inspire. We know who our audience is. We've got a brand core. We're trying to create a brand all about making families happier. And we've got our donut, which has all the additional content about our values, our vision, our positioning, and all those things. And these are the tools really that you then need to then start thinking about your name. Now, obviously, you can get digital with names, go online, do research, search things up, look at dictionaries, look at thesaurus, look at kind of wordplay. Wordplay games are really great for naming. There's loads of links here and they're all in the sheets. But also get playful, get physically playful. We kind of have Scrabble sets, pick out random letters, pick up a book, just pick up a random book, go to a random page, pick a random word. How does that inspire you? What does that make you think of? And getting playful with naming is really important. I would really avoid using AI. There's lots of AI, and even since I started this course, the ChatGPT world, but it won't really create a brand name that's going to be suitable for you. It won't understand the nuances behind what your brand is. Use them as research tools, but don't rely on them to find you a unique name. And chances are they just want to sell you a domain. But keep having ideas. Naming takes time. Don't stop. This is the one thing that, you won't do this in an afternoon. You might think of a name straight away, but keep going back to it. Keep pushing yourself. Keep having ideas to make it more original. As I've been creating this course, I've been thinking about setting up a cheese company. And what I've come up with is 4 different names. I've come up with Cheese Please, Wedge, Moonful, and Jurham. And they've all got different benefits. So Wedge, it's a very literal, real name. You could just be, like a wedge of cheese, but it's very hard to own that. But it's kind of short and memorable. Moonful, moonful of cheese. So it's kind of got a little romanticism to it. It tells a story, and that's always good. So it's real, bit obscure, but once you get into it, I think that made up obscure things can get a bit confusing. So just taking vowels out of words, it might sound hip, but it will confuse people potentially. But also things that are made up and quite literal are very easy to create. So I created this name, Cheese Please, just actually spelt please like cheese, and then you've got something that's quite playful, and that's the name that I'm actually going to develop for my brand for Frantic Fiona, because I thought it was kind of fun and appropriate. But think about the names that you're creating. Are they easy to tell a story about? Are they hard to own? There is actually a task that I would encourage you to do, is think about your favorite brand. We did that right at the start. I chose Adidas. And just search Google brand name origin or something like that, and you will find the story behind the brand name. And just write it down. Try and identify the different categories. So if I think about Adidas, it's actually a compound of the founder's name, Adolf Dassler. Basically, he used to be called Addy. So it's a people founder name, but with a mashup contraction. And just sort of have a bit of fun of thinking about brand names that you love and discovering why they're called what they're called. And there will always be a reason behind it. The ones that don't have a reason are probably less of a compelling brand name. So the final bit of naming is obviously all about choosing the name. So I've got a short list, Cheese Please, Cheddar, Moonful, and Wedge. At the time, I checked about availability, but don't get too obsessed. You can always make something more available. The most important thing to do is to check that someone else isn't using it. I would live with the name. This is definitely something to do. Once you've got a short list of names, stick them on a fridge, think about them for a little while. Don't just jump on the name and think this is it. I think it's good to share these things with people, get some feedback, back to the kind of creative process that we did at the start. But there is actually a sort of a criteria that you can do. There's a worksheet if you've got your list of brand names, and you can go through it and just sort of check it for, is it easy to say, spell, is it unique and available? And actually, when I did this initially, Wedge as a brand name was available. It was a lot of money. It was like $50,000. But, it's a sort of name that you think, well, no way we could have that. It's got to have been taken. It wasn't. But actually, if I was then thinking of using that name, I'd be able to find a way to use Wedge in a way with a domain that hasn't been taken, providing no one is using Wedge as a cheese business. Actually, someone is using Wedge as a finance company. So think about it before across those sort of criteria. As I say, I went with cheese please because it's easy to say, spell. I thought it was quite unique. I mean, I think you have to say it's cheese please with a double E, but that's not too hard, and it was available at the time. Something to do as soon as you've got your name, though, is to really create something simple for it. Just get the domain up, start gathering information. As soon as you tell people you've set up your business, they'll be wanting to go to the website, but that's going to take you a while to actually build and deliver. So just get something up that collects some data and actually start engaging people just in case they do go to it. So if you like, you can kind of create a summary of your brand names that you've got. It's quite a useful thing to do, actually. Think about the brand name, what your story is. Sometimes people have different registered business names, and we're trying to organize all this. Primary URL, secondary URLs are quite useful to have for businesses if you've got a different sort of angle of attracting people. Get all this written down, try and align the social stuff. It's a lot more constraints on social, and actually a lot more names have been taken. I've tended to find than actually on the other, on registration, because people can generally register a name for free on the social, but they don't want to pay for it. So really have a look at what your names are and try and get alignment behind it. So the next section is all about messaging. But before we get too into messaging, we need to understand a little bit about tone of voice. And tone of voice is really a combination of factors about what you're saying, who you're saying it to, when you say it, and how you say it. And it creates this sort of style and this unique personality around the words and the messages that you put out there. And if you think about it in the context of different audiences, how you speak to people is going to be different each time. So if you said hello to a stranger for the first time, you would probably be quite formal and say hello. But if you said hello to a mate every time, you'd be less formal and say yo. I never say yo. But those are the different considerations that we're thinking: the what, the who, the when, and the how. And that creates a different kind of message each time. And I'm going to break that down into sort of individual sections. So thinking about the what, it's all about the hierarchy of messaging. And this is really important in terms of thinking about how you construct sort of, from it could be a social post to on a website, is think of it like, you've got a headline, introduction, body copy, small print. These are the sort of hierarchy of messages, just like you would find on a newspaper, but they are delivered in different ways. So the headline is trying to grab people's attention. You're then trying to pull them in and engage them, keep them reading. Then you've got to inform them, and finally you've got to give them some instruction. And if you think about it like that, just like a newspaper, you'll have to then think about what's going to stop the scroll and what's going to grab their attention, but then keep them reading. And it's really important to think of those things. Don't just start off with some information and some instruction, because it won't grab their attention. So think about the hierarchy of messaging. The next thing is obviously the audience is really important. And I think the number one thing for me with the audience is that you tend to have to reflect, respect, resonate, and respond how they are. If you're not talking to your audience like they expect to be spoken to, which is kind of, the obvious thing, then they'll find it really disconnecting when they see your messages. You've really got to understand your audience and think about how they would like to be spoken to, which is again why we try to focus on one audience, even though there's lots of different people that are going to buy your products and service. But what is the general tone that they would expect? The next bit, customer journey, is really important, because as people are kind of coming across your brand, they'll discover you at different times in the journey, from a state generally of being unaware, becoming more engaged, and then working with you and delivering stuff to them or selling things to them. And we kind of break this down into three kind of rough zones: building that relationship, converting that relationship into a sale, or retaining that relationship. And depending what state in the customer journey you're at, they will probably have different needs and responses from you to actually create messages. So you can't just always go in with a big sales message if they've not got engaged with you. If they're unaware of you, your task is to grab their attention and just make them aware of you before you start selling to them. Once you've sold to them, you've got to remember to keep in actually contact with them to retain their loyalty and their advocacy, because that's really important for your repeated sales. But again, you don't need to start from scratch on that journey because they're already aware of you. So you'll be writing different ways for different parts of that journey. The final bit is actually just going to show you how to create a distinct tone of voice for you. So I think about this in terms of, if you think about, go from one extreme, from being very artificial to being very human. I genuinely believe that, you should have a little bit of artificialness in there. I think you do need a little bit of that functional tone that actually just brings out the detail. At the same time, you've got to be mostly human though, because that's the human connection that we're trying to do. So if I was just saying to people, on a scale of, 1 to 5, how functional and how emotional would you be? Most people I've ever done this with pick out they want to be a 3 or 4. And that to me sounds about right. So you're mostly human with a little bit of functionality in there. But that's not enough to give you a guidance for how to actually write. You need a clearer steer. So I created this thing where sort of think about the dominant tones in how you write. So I would suggest pick one matter of functional tone, matter of fact, respectful, formal. These are at the extremes. Pick an emotional tone, enthusiastic, irreverent, casual, or fun. Again, they're on the opposite extremes of being very emotional. Which ones of those resonate the most with you? And pick one blue word and pick one pink. Then the final thing that I also say is that you need a little bit more of a degree in between that. So here we've got a bunch of words. We've got five words on each row. Is pick one word from each row that actually most resonate with you. Now, if you start to pick all words from the bottom end, if you just say direct, trustworthy, professional, authoritative, you will find that your tone of voice is too functional. It's just not going to engage enough. Similarly, if you just said passionate, edgy, chatty, and playful all the time, that's going to be far too emotional. It's going to kind of overwhelm people, which is why we want to pick a sort of stretch of words across this. So try it out. I mean, sometimes it's easy just to start with picking out 5 words that connect with you and then seeing which are the emotional and functional words that go with it. There is a worksheet that can help you. The one thing to avoid though is being too extreme. If you get too functional, you're going to be cold and boring. If you're too emotional, you could end up being eager, coarse, flippant, which some brands kind of use, but it's going to be really difficult for you to manage your brand with that sort of tone of voice. There is a worksheet that helps you go through all this, and I would suggest starting with the words in white and then building out from it. But whatever you do, just try and pick some 4 words that actually really help overall with your writing, and then some dominant tones from the functional and the emotional side that will just give you a steer. And then actually, without getting too obsessed with ChatGTP, you can use that as a trigger to influence the writing, because you say, right, I need this to be direct, kind, conversational, and playful. And then that's the sort of tone of voice that you think is right for your audience. I've done all this for the cheese protagonist. So, for Frantic Fiona, I'm being clear, kind, conversational, playful. Very matter of fact, but I want it to be fun. This is very different for Colin. It's more passionate. It's a bit more concise. He's smart. I want it to be serious but enthusiastic. And so you can see how for different audiences that you're trying to attract, different businesses that you can change that tone of voice. But it's all about degrees. You've got to think about the journey. You've got to think about when you're saying this to people. And there's sort of an overlay of different information that is going to be required at different times. But just having a starting point for your personality will really help. And you can sort of see then when I take those tone of voice, these just coming up with grab type headlines, bees knees cheese. It's more fun, matured for 4,000 years. It's got a bit of that kind of educational, kind of informative stuff. And Curious Colin, it's a bit romantic, the cheese that dreams are made of. So you can use your tone of voice to create those sort of grabbing headlines that are really going to connect with your audience. The next thing I'm going to talk about is actually pushing that a little bit further. And there's a task here to think about the headlines and how you might actually write those to different stages of the customer journey. And I'm going to do it over these 3 phases: the build, the convert, and the retain. And if you think about it like, the build phase, it's about, getting noticed. You want people to sit up and take notice of you. But the conversion phase, it's all about people trying it And then actually in retention, you just want to give them more. And it sort of sets up a different type of message that you might be using for those different types of things. If you think about, creating these headlines, you can use this worksheet. I think about where they're going to see the message. What are the messages? Are they going to be used on social? Are they going to be used as part of an email? Are they going to be used at the homepage of your website? Because that might also impact what the message might be. I've got some examples here for Frantic Fiona. So the build phase, we're sort of just getting them excited about, pizza, too good for pineapple sticks, but brill on pizza. So it's sort of lightweight in tone, but it's still quite matter of fact. At the conversion phase, we're actually putting an offer in now, but we're still being fun. All our cheese is off, 20% off. And then when we get to the retention phase, we're just trying to be a little bit more kind of, sort of encouraging our loyalty with other people. So we're actually giving them a reward and stuff like that. So we're just slightly changing the tone. So do try that exercise and see if you can write some headlines for your tone of voice that are going to really stick with your audience. The final thing that I want to talk about is straplines. And really there's two approaches to doing a strapline. One is to be quite descriptive about it, so quite factual and quite literal, or be more emotional. And that inspires people and motivates them. So if you think about Nokia connecting people, it's quite descriptive, it's very clever. You think about Tesco, every little helps. And it's kind of got this promise built into it. Makes you believe what it says on the tin rather than just describing it. I think most businesses probably need a descriptive strapline because it takes quite a long time for an emotive strapline to be understood and embedded. So if you've been in business a little while and maybe you've had a few messages out there, you could probably start moving into that sort of territory. Make sure it's clear, concise. I would say, clearly, the fewer words, the better, because it makes it more memorable. But for a long-term descriptor, it's not about actually people remembering the strapline. It's about them understanding more about your business. Use humor, focus on what makes you unique. In the literal ones, it's probably going to be inspired more by what's in your position and the offer, those sections of the donut, because that's the sort of the more literal bit. If you're thinking of something more emotional, it's going to be around your values, your mission and core, because that's the more emotional part of it. So focus on those areas. Think about what a promise and belief might be. I would also say consider registering the domains. If you've got something like Every Little Helps, having everylittle.helps.com is quite a good thing if people start searching for your strapline. So think about your unique brand promise. Think about what makes you different. Think about those bits of the donut, and then go forward and try and write a strapline. And I look forward to seeing what you create with that. So think about the audience, think about what's unique about your business, think about what's different with your competition. All these things will help you write that killer strapline that will engage and you can use memorably across all your communication. Here's an example for the cheese people. So cheese please, meals with ease. So just kind of lent into the rhyming part of that. For Wedge, it's a cut above. There's a bit of arrogance to that because I think there's a bit of arrogance to that personality. Whereas Moonfall, spread the love. Again, he's the old romantic. So we're thinking about the personality of the people and the straplines that are going to engage with them. So hopefully that helps you. So here are all the tasks. And I say this session is split into two halves, one about naming, one about messaging. The task that is a must-do task really is the defining your tone of voice. It's really important you do that so then you can start to developing the right sort of messaging that's going to connect with the audience. Have a go at the strapline because you might find that useful as you start to develop communications. So the next session is all about engaging visually. These are all about the words. Now, next it's all going to be about the pictures, and I look forward to seeing you on the next session.